The flight attendant looked at me like I was a criminal who had somehow snuck into first class, her eyes scanning my boarding pass 3 times before reluctantly pointing to my seat. Little did she know, I was actually on my way to protect the very country she seemed to think I didn't belong in. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Maya Richardson, and for the past 8 years, I've served my country as a Central Intelligence Agency operative. At 32, I've been deployed to 14 different countries, stopped 3 terrorist plots, and saved countless American lives. But on that Tuesday morning in October, boarding Flight 447 from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, none of that seemed to matter to the woman checking my ticket. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, wasn't easy for a black girl with big dreams. My neighborhood was rough around the edges, filled with boarded-up houses and streets where hope seemed as cracked as the sidewalks. But my parents, Jerome and Angela Richardson, refused to let our circumstances define our destiny. My father worked double shifts at the Ford plant while studying for his teaching degree at night. My mother cleaned offices downtown during the day and took nursing classes on weekends. They were living proof that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. "Maya, baby," my mother would tell me as she helped me with homework at our small kitchen table, "your mind is your passport to anywhere you want to go in this world. Don't let nobody tell you differently." Our house was small, a 2-bedroom bungalow with thin walls and drafty windows, but it was filled with love, books, and endless conversations about current events. My parents made sure I understood the world beyond our neighborhood. They subscribed to newspapers they could barely afford and watched the evening news religiously, discussing politics and international affairs over dinner every night. When I was 12, something happened that would shape the rest of my life. A terrorist attack overseas had dominated the headlines for weeks, and I watched my parents' faces as they discussed the complex geopolitical factors that had led to the tragedy. That night, I announced to them that I wanted to work for the government someday, to help protect people from those who would do them harm. "That's a big dream, sweetheart," my father said, his eyes twinkling with pride. "But if anyone can do it, it's you." School became my sanctuary and my battlefield. I excelled academically, but I also faced the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that pervaded even our predominantly black school. Some teachers had lower expectations for students from my neighborhood. Guidance counselors steered kids like me toward vocational programs instead of college prep courses. But I had advantages many of my classmates didn't: parents who believed in education and who fought for me every step of the way. When a guidance counselor suggested I consider community college instead of applying to 4-year universities, my mother marched into that school the next day wearing her best dress and her most determined expression. "My daughter has a 4.0 GPA and scored in the 95th percentile on her SATs," she told the counselor firmly. "She's applying to Georgetown, Harvard, and Stanford, and you're going to help her do it right." The scholarship to Georgetown University felt like winning the lottery. When the acceptance letter arrived, my parents cried tears of joy, and my father called in sick to work so we could celebrate properly. Moving to Washington, D.C. was like entering a different world, a world of privilege and opportunity that I had only seen in movies. At Georgetown, I majored in international relations with a minor in Arabic studies. I threw myself into my studies with the intensity of someone who knew this chance might never come again. I joined the debate team, volunteered for political campaigns, and spent my summers interning at various government agencies. My professors took notice of my dedication and intelligence, but I still encountered subtle forms of discrimination. There was the professor who seemed surprised when I turned in exceptional work, as if academic excellence was unexpected from someone who looked like me. There were study groups where I felt like I had to prove myself twice as hard as my white classmates. There were career fairs where recruiters seemed more interested in talking to students who didn't share my skin color. But I persevered, driven by my parents' sacrifices and my own burning desire to serve my country. I graduated summa cum laude with a 3.98 GPA, fluent in Arabic, French, and Spanish, with working knowledge of Mandarin and Russian. The CIA recruitment officer who interviewed me during my senior year seemed impressed despite himself. "Ms. Richardson," he said, reviewing my file, "your academic record is outstanding and your language skills are exactly what we need. But I have to ask, are you prepared for the challenges you'll face as a minority woman in the intelligence community?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Sir, I've been preparing for those challenges my entire life. The question is whether the CIA is ready for what I can bring to the table." He smiled for the first time during our interview. "I think you're going to fit in just fine." The training at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, was the most grueling experience of my life. Physical conditioning, weapons training, surveillance techniques, psychological warfare, cultural immersion. Every day brought new challenges designed to push trainees to their breaking point. Many of my classmates had military backgrounds or came from families with long histories of government service. I was one of only 3 black women in a class of 47. During those intense months, I learned that being underestimated could be an advantage. While instructors expected certain trainees to excel based on their backgrounds, I flew under the radar, quietly outperforming many of my more pedigreed classmates. When final rankings were announced, I had finished 3rd in the class overall and 1st in languages and cultural intelligence. My first assignment took me to Cairo, Egypt, where I worked undercover as a cultural attaché at the American Embassy. The real mission involved infiltrating networks suspected of funneling money to terrorist organizations. It was dangerous work that required me to navigate complex cultural dynamics while maintaining my cover identity. The fact that I was a young black woman actually helped in some situations. People didn't expect me to be an intelligence operative, which gave me access to information that might have been harder for my colleagues to obtain. Over the next 8 years, my assignments took me around the world. I posed as a journalist in Damascus, a businesswoman in Lagos, and a graduate student in Karachi. I learned to speak local dialects, to blend into different cultures, and to earn the trust of people who had every reason to be suspicious of Americans. My success rate was exceptional. I had helped prevent numerous attacks and had provided intelligence that saved countless lives. By the time I was 32, I had earned the respect of my colleagues and the trust of my superiors. I lived in a beautiful condominium in Arlington, Virginia, drove a reliable Honda Accord, and had built a life that my teenage self would have thought impossible. I thought I had transcended the limitations that society tried to place on young black women from Detroit. But racism has a way of humbling you, reminding you that no matter how far you climb, some people will always see your skin color before they see your achievements. That Tuesday morning in October, I was traveling to Los Angeles for what appeared to be a routine business consulting assignment. My cover story was that I worked for Richardson International Security Consultants, a firm that advised corporations on global risk assessment. In reality, I was being deployed to monitor a suspected terrorist cell that the FBI had been tracking for several months. Recent intelligence suggested they were planning an attack on critical infrastructure in Southern California, possibly targeting the ports or the electrical grid. The mission was classified at the highest levels. Even the FBI agents I would be working with didn't know my true identity. They thought I was a State Department liaison with expertise in Middle Eastern terrorist organizations. Failure wasn't an option. American lives hung in the balance, and I was one of the few operatives with the specific language skills and cultural knowledge needed to penetrate this particular network. I had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue blazer from Brooks Brothers, a crisp white blouse and well-tailored black slacks. My shoes were comfortable but professional, Italian leather loafers that could handle both boardroom meetings and surveillance work. My hair was pulled back in a neat chignon, and I carried a leather briefcase that contained both my cover documents and my actual credentials, secured in a hidden compartment. I looked like any other successful business traveler heading to the West Coast for important meetings. I had paid for the first-class upgrade myself, using my own money, because the 5-hour flight would give me uninterrupted time to review case files and prepare for the mission ahead. I should have felt confident and prepared. Instead, I was about to be reminded that in some people's eyes, I would always be seen as out of place, regardless of my qualifications or my service to my country. The trouble started before I even reached the gate. Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport was bustling with the usual Tuesday morning crowd of business travelers, tourists and government workers. I had arrived 90 minutes early as was my habit for important flights. Security screening had gone smoothly, my credentials allowed me to use the expedited line, and the TSA agents who saw my identification treated me with the professional courtesy typically accorded to federal employees. But as I made my way to Gate B12, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten with familiar dread. The gate area was crowded with passengers, most of whom appeared to be white business travelers heading to Los Angeles. I was one of only a handful of black passengers visible in the waiting area, and definitely the only black woman who appeared to be traveling in first class. Gate agent Patricia Morrison stood behind the counter like a sentinel guarding a fortress. She was a middle-aged white woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed painted on. Her name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and she wore her airline uniform with the kind of precision that suggested she took great pride in her authority. I approached the counter to confirm my seat assignment and ask about the expected departure time. It was a routine interaction, the kind I had performed hundreds of times in airports around the world. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, placing my boarding pass on the counter. I just wanted to confirm that we're still on time for departure. Patricia looked up from her computer screen with an expression I had seen too many times before. It was a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed disdain, the look that said, "You don't belong here." Her eyes immediately went to my boarding pass, then to my face, then back to the boarding pass. "I'm going to need to see your identification," she said, her voice carrying a tone that suggested this was not a routine request. I had just gone through security screening 20 minutes earlier, but I calmly pulled out my driver's license and handed it to her. She studied it with the intensity of a detective examining evidence at a crime scene, holding it up to the light and comparing the photo to my face multiple times. "Is this your boarding pass?" she asked, picking up the document I had just handed her. "Yes, it is," I replied, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the growing tension in my chest. She examined the boarding pass as if it were written in hieroglyphics, turning it over several times and squinting at the barcode. "This shows first class," she said, as if I might not be aware of what I had purchased. "That's correct," I said. "Seat 2A. Patricia frowned and began typing furiously on her computer, occasionally glancing at me as if I might disappear if she looked away. Other passengers in line behind me were beginning to shift impatiently, and I could feel their eyes on my back. "Ma'am, I'm showing some discrepancies in our system," she said, though she didn't specify what those discrepancies might be. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor." "What kind of discrepancies?" I asked, keeping my voice level and professional. "Just some irregularities," she said vaguely, picking up her phone to call for backup. I stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, watching as Patricia made a show of investigating my perfectly legitimate reservation. She pulled up multiple screens on her computer, made several phone calls, and generally created the impression that something was seriously wrong with my travel documents. Supervisor Kevin Walsh approached the counter with the confident stride of someone accustomed to resolving problems. He was a middle-aged white man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression that suggested he had seen it all during his years in the airline industry. "What seems to be the issue, Patricia?" he asked, though his eyes were fixed on me rather than his employee. "I'm having trouble verifying this passenger's reservation," Patricia explained, handing him my boarding pass and identification. "The system is showing some inconsistencies." Kevin studied my documents with the same exaggerated care that Patricia had exhibited, as if they were ancient artifacts that required special expertise to authenticate. He typed something on the computer, frowned, and typed something else. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while we sort this out," he said, gesturing toward a nearby seating area. "Sometimes the system gets confused when reservations are made through third-party websites." "I didn't use a third-party website," I said, my patience beginning to wear thin. "I booked directly through your airline's website using my credit card. My reservation confirmation is right here." I showed him the email on my phone. "Well, we still need to verify a few things," Kevin said, not bothering to look at my phone. "It shouldn't take long." I moved to the designated seating area, acutely aware that other passengers were now openly staring at the commotion. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head and muttered something about airline incompetence. A woman with a designer handbag looked at me sympathetically, as if I were the victim of some unfortunate computer glitch rather than deliberate harassment. For the next 20 minutes, I watched Patricia and Kevin engage in an elaborate performance of customer service theater. They made multiple phone calls, consulted with other staff members, and generally created the impression that my reservation was the most complicated booking in aviation history. During this time, they processed dozens of other passengers without incident, including several who were also traveling in first class. The difference in treatment was stark and impossible to ignore. White passengers approached the counter, handed over their boarding passes, received friendly greetings, and were processed efficiently. I sat there with valid documents, watching the same two employees who had questioned my right to be there treat other travelers with courtesy and respect. Finally, Kevin approached me with my documents in hand and an expression that suggested he was doing me an enormous favor. "We've resolved the issue," he announced as if he had just performed a miracle of customer service. "You can board with the other first-class passengers." "What was the issue?" I asked, genuinely curious about what problem they had supposedly discovered and resolved. "Oh, just a minor glitch in the system," he said dismissively. "These things happen sometimes." But as I took my documents back, I noticed something interesting. The timestamps on the various screens behind the counter showed that they had accessed my reservation multiple times over the past 20 minutes, but there had been no actual changes made to my booking. They had simply been stalling, creating delays and complications where none existed. The message was clear: They didn't think I belonged in first class and they were going to make me prove my worthiness to be there. But the humiliation was far from over. The real trial was about to begin once I stepped onto the plane. Flight attendant Jessica Reynolds made Patricia Morrison and Kevin Walsh look like models of customer service excellence. She stood at the entrance to the aircraft with the kind of smile that airline magazines feature in their advertisements, perfectly white teeth, professionally applied makeup, and blonde hair styled in an immaculate bun. But the moment I stepped onto the plane and she saw my first-class boarding pass, that smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice carrying all the warmth of a winter morning in Detroit. Her eyes followed me as I made my way down the aisle, and I could feel her gaze boring into my back as I located my seat. Seat 2A was a premium location, an aisle seat in the second row with extra legroom and easy access to the overhead compartments. I had specifically chosen this seat because it would allow me to observe other passengers while reviewing my mission materials. As an intelligence operative, I was trained to be aware of my surroundings at all times, and this seat provided optimal situational awareness. I settled into my seat and began organizing my materials for the flight. I had brought several files disguised as business documents, along with a laptop and tablet for communication with my handlers. Everything appeared routine and professional, exactly what you would expect from a business consultant traveling to an important client meeting. That's when Jessica appeared at my row, her smile now completely absent. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough to attract attention from nearby passengers. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." I looked up at her with surprise. This was now the fourth time in less than an hour that someone had demanded to see the same piece of paper. "Is there a problem?" I asked. "Just following protocol," she replied, though her tone suggested that this was anything but routine. Sometimes passengers get confused about their seat assignments. I handed over my boarding pass without comment, though inside I was beginning to seethe. Jessica studied the document with exaggerated care, looking back and forth between the boarding pass and the seat number displayed above my head. She was putting on quite a performance for the other first-class passengers, most of whom were white men in expensive business suits. "Are you absolutely certain you're in the right seat?" she asked, emphasizing each word as if she were speaking to someone with limited comprehension. "Yes, I'm certain," I replied, my voice carefully controlled despite my growing frustration. "This is my assigned seat." Jessica continued to stand there, boarding pass in hand, as if she were waiting for me to confess to some elaborate seat-switching scheme. The businessman across the aisle was now openly watching our interaction, his expression a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. "Well," Jessica said finally, handing back my boarding pass with obvious reluctance, "I suppose everything appears to be in order. But I'll need to keep an eye on things throughout the flight." That last statement hung in the air like smoke from a fire. What exactly did she need to keep an eye on? What did she think I was going to do? The implication was clear. She viewed me as a potential problem that required monitoring. As the plane filled with passengers, I had an opportunity to observe Jessica's interactions with other travelers. The contrast in her behavior was striking and impossible to ignore. When a white businessman in his 50s took the seat next to me, she greeted him warmly, offered him a pre-departure beverage and asked about his comfort. When an elderly white woman needed help stowing her carry-on bag, Jessica rushed to assist her with genuine enthusiasm. But when she passed my row, she avoided eye contact and spoke to me in clipped, professional tones that were devoid of any warmth or courtesy. It was as if I were invisible except when she needed to assert her authority over me. During the pre-flight safety demonstration, Jessica made sure to position herself where she could maintain visual contact with my seat. While other flight attendants focused on demonstrating safety procedures, she kept glancing in my direction as if she expected me to suddenly become disruptive. The captain's announcement was routine. We would be flying at 35,000 feet, the weather in Los Angeles was clear, and our estimated flight time was 4 hours and 53 minutes. As we taxied toward the runway, I tried to focus on my mission briefing materials, but Jessica's constant surveillance was making it difficult to concentrate. Once we were airborne and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the real harassment began in earnest. The first incident occurred during the beverage service. Jessica worked her way through the first-class cabin with a cart full of drinks and snacks, chatting pleasantly with each passenger about their preferences. When she reached the businessman next to me, she offered him a choice of several premium beverages and brought him a small plate of warm nuts. When she turned to me, her demeanor changed completely. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, her voice flat and businesslike. "I'll have a coffee, please," I said. "Black, no sugar." "We're out of coffee," she said immediately, though I had just watched her pour coffee for the passenger sitting directly across the aisle. You just served coffee to the gentleman over there? I pointed out politely. That was the last of it, Jessica replied without missing a beat. I can offer you tea or juice. It was a lie and we both knew it. The coffee maker was clearly visible on her cart, steam still rising from the pot. But she was establishing a pattern of service that would continue throughout the flight. Other passengers received what they requested, while I was offered substitutes and excuses. Tea would be fine, I said, deciding not to escalate the situation over a cup of coffee. She poured lukewarm tea from what appeared to be the bottom of the pot and placed it on my tray table without the courtesy of a napkin or stirrer. The businessman next to me noticed the difference in service and looked uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. During the meal service, Jessica's discrimination became even more blatant. She approached each first-class passenger with a choice of entrees, grilled salmon with herbs or herb-crusted chicken breast. The meals looked delicious and were elegantly presented in real china with proper silverware. When she reached my row, she offered the salmon to my seatmate and then turned to me with an apologetic expression that didn't reach her eyes. I'm sorry, she said loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear, but we seem to have run out of both entrees. I can offer you the vegetarian option from coach class. I stared at her in disbelief. She had just offered salmon to the passenger sitting 18 inches away from me, and I could see several meals still available on her cart. But she was claiming that the airline had somehow miscalculated their catering by exactly one meal. Mine. I see meals on your cart, I said quietly, trying to maintain my composure. Those are reserved for other passengers, Jessica replied, her voice taking on a defensive tone. I can get you a nice salad from the back. The businessman next to me looked mortified. He started to offer me his meal, but I stopped him with a gesture. This wasn't about food, it was about dignity and respect. The vegetarian option will be fine, I said, though my voice was tight with controlled anger. Jessica returned 15 minutes later with a sad-looking sandwich and a bag of chips that appeared to have come from the coach cabin snack service. She placed it on my tray table with a satisfied expression, as if she had somehow solved a complex logistics problem. The message was unmistakable. I didn't belong in first class and she was going to make sure I knew it. But Jessica wasn't content to simply provide inferior service. She seemed determined to create incidents that would justify her obvious hostility toward me. 2 hours into the flight, I got up to use the restroom. As I walked toward the front of the plane, Jessica appeared seemingly out of nowhere, moving to block my path. Excuse me, she said, her voice carrying enough volume to attract attention from nearby passengers. Where are you going? I looked at her with confusion. To the restroom, I replied. The restroom in the back of the plane would be more appropriate for you, she said, pointing toward the coach section. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. I'm a first-class passenger, I said firmly. I'm entitled to use the first-class restroom. I'll need to see your boarding pass again, Jessica said, crossing her arms over her chest in a gesture of authority. This was beyond absurd. We were now 3 hours into a 5-hour flight, and she was demanding to see my boarding pass for the 5th time. She knew exactly where I was sitting and what I had paid for, but she was creating a scene in front of other passengers. I pulled out my boarding pass and handed it to her, aware that several first-class passengers were now openly staring at our interaction. Jessica examined the document with theatrical intensity, as if she was discovering new information with each viewing. Well, she said finally, handing it back with obvious reluctance. I suppose that's acceptable. But I'll need to monitor the situation. That phrase, monitor the situation, revealed everything about how she saw me. I wasn't a paying customer entitled to the services I had purchased. It was a situation to be managed, a problem to be contained, a potential threat that required constant surveillance. As I continued toward the restroom, I heard her speaking to another flight attendant in a voice that was meant to be overheard. We need to keep an eye on that one. She's been acting suspiciously since takeoff. I had done nothing suspicious. I had been sitting quietly in my assigned seat, reading business documents and occasionally checking my phone. But in Jessica's mind, my mere presence in first class was inherently suspicious. When I returned to my seat, I found that she had somehow managed to spill water on my tray table and had cleaned it up by moving my papers and laptop. Nothing was damaged, but the message was clear. Even when I wasn't there, she felt entitled to interfere with my personal space. The elderly woman sitting across the aisle caught my eye and mouthed the word, sorry. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. At least one person recognized what was happening and disapproved. But Jessica wasn't finished with her campaign of harassment. She seemed determined to push things to a confrontation, and as we began our descent into Los Angeles, she made her final move. As the captain announced our initial descent into Los Angeles International Airport, I was reviewing the final details of my mission briefing. In less than 2 hours, I would be meeting with FBI agents to begin surveillance of a terrorist cell that posed a significant threat to American infrastructure. The success of this operation could prevent attacks that might kill hundreds or thousands of innocent people. But Jessica Reynolds had other priorities. She appeared at my seat carrying what looked like an incident report form and wearing an expression of grim determination. "Ma'am," she said, her voice loud enough to ensure that surrounding passengers could hear every word, "I need to inform you that your behavior during this flight has been highly concerning." I looked up from my documents with genuine confusion. "What behavior are you referring to?" "You've been acting suspiciously throughout the entire flight," she continued, her confidence growing as she sensed she had an audience. "Moving around the cabin inappropriately, asking inappropriate questions, making other passengers uncomfortable with your aggressive behavior." I stared at her in complete disbelief. Every word she had just spoken was a fabrication. I had moved around the cabin exactly once, to use the restroom. I had asked no questions except about the meal service. And the only person who had been aggressive was Jessica herself. "I haven't done anything inappropriate or suspicious," I said calmly, though my heart was beginning to race with anger. "I've been sitting quietly in my assigned seat for the entire flight." "That's not how I witnessed the situation," Jessica replied, her voice becoming more aggressive and authoritative. "You've been disruptive and confrontational. You've questioned my authority multiple times and created disturbances that have made other passengers uncomfortable." Now she was rewriting history entirely. She was the one who had questioned my right to be there. She was the one who had created every disturbance. She was the one who had been confrontational and disruptive. But she wasn't finished with her performance. "I'm going to file a formal report with airport security," she announced, holding up the incident form as if it were a court summons. "I believe you pose a potential security risk, and I think airport security should be made aware of your behavior before you're allowed to deplane." The other passengers were now openly staring at our confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, clearly recognizing that something was very wrong with Jessica's account of events. Others seemed confused, trying to reconcile her claims with what they had actually observed during the flight. The businessman sitting next to me finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said to Jessica, "but I've been sitting right here the entire flight, and this lady hasn't done anything inappropriate. She's been reading quietly and minding her own business." Jessica turned on him with barely concealed fury. "Sir, I'm trained to recognize suspicious behavior, and I'm telling you that this passenger has been problematic throughout the flight." "No, she hasn't," said the elderly woman across the aisle, her voice shaking slightly but determined. "You've been harassing her since we took off. I've never seen anything like it." More passengers began to murmur their agreement, and Jessica's face was becoming red with anger and embarrassment. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her accusations. "I don't care what you think you saw," she said, her voice rising to a near shout. "I'm responsible for the safety and security of this aircraft, and I'm telling you that this woman has been acting suspiciously. Airport security will be meeting us at the gate to escort her off the plane for questioning." That's when I realized that Jessica wasn't just engaged in racial profiling, she was trying to create a situation where I would be detained and questioned by airport security, possibly missing my mission assignment and compromising a critical national security operation. At that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I reached into my briefcase and activated the hidden compartment that contained my federal credentials. From it, I extracted a leather folder that held my CIA identification, my federal law enforcement badge, and several classified documents that established my authority and security clearance. "Before you file any reports or call any security," I said, my voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable note of authority, "I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with." I stood up to my full height and held my credentials where Jessica and the surrounding passengers could see them clearly. "My name is Special Agent Maya Richardson," I announced, my voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin. "I'm a Central Intelligence Agency operative, and I'm currently traveling on official government business related to national security." Jessica's face went through a remarkable transformation. The smug confidence drained away like water from a broken dam, replaced by shock, then fear, then something approaching panic. She stared at my credentials as if they were written in a language she couldn't comprehend. I don't understand," she stammered, her aggressive posture collapsing into uncertainty. What you don't understand, I said, my voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each word, is that while you've been harassing me for the past 5 hours, I've been preparing for a mission that could save American lives. While you've been questioning my right to sit in a seat I paid for with my own money, I've been reviewing intelligence that could prevent terrorist attacks on American soil. The cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger within earshot was listening to this exchange with rapt attention, and many were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. For the past 8 years, I continued, my voice filled with the accumulated frustration of a lifetime of discrimination, I have served this country with distinction. I have risked my life in places you couldn't pronounce to keep Americans safe. I have infiltrated terrorist organizations, prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent people, and provided intelligence that has protected our national security. Jessica looked like she wanted to disappear into the aircraft's flooring. I was just doing my job, she said weakly. No, I replied firmly, my voice cutting through her pathetic excuse like a knife. Your job is to ensure passengers' safety and comfort while providing professional customer service. Instead, you have spent this entire flight engaging in racial profiling and harassment based on nothing more than the color of my skin. I looked around the cabin at the other passengers, many of whom were now recording this confrontation with their smartphones. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, addressing the entire first-class section, I want you to remember what you've witnessed here today. This is what racial discrimination looks like in the 21st century. This is how prejudice manifests in everyday situations that most people never see or acknowledge. I turned back to Jessica, who was standing there with tears beginning to form in her eyes. You saw a black woman in first class and immediately assumed I didn't belong here, I continued. You demanded to see my boarding pass 5 separate times. You provided me with inferior food and service. You questioned my right to use the restroom. You fabricated accusations of suspicious behavior. And finally, you threatened to have me detained by security. The businessman next to me was shaking his head in disgust. This is absolutely unacceptable, he said loudly. I'm going to file a complaint with the airline about this behavior. So am I, said the elderly woman across the aisle. What I've witnessed today is shameful and inexcusable. Other passengers began voicing their agreement and outrage, creating a chorus of condemnation that seemed to physically shrink Jessica with each comment. But I wasn't finished. You know what the most ironic part of this situation is? I asked Jessica, my voice now carrying a note of sad reflection. While you've been treating me like a criminal, I've been on my way to Los Angeles to help prevent actual criminals from harming the people of this country. While you've been questioning my patriotism and my right to be here, I've been dedicating my life to protecting the freedoms and security that make America great. I paused, letting that truth sink in for everyone listening. I won't be filing a complaint against you personally, I said quietly, because I have more important things to worry about than your ignorance and prejudice. But I want you to think about what happened here today. I want you to remember that you don't know anything about the people you're serving just by looking at their skin color. And I want you to understand that every time you treat someone poorly because of their race, you're betraying the very values that this country was founded on. Jessica was now crying openly, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks in dark streaks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Don't apologize to me, I said firmly. Apologize to every person of color who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in a space they had every right to occupy. Apologize to every black child who might grow up thinking they don't deserve to dream big because people like you keep telling them they don't belong. Apologize to this country for betraying its promise of equality and justice for all. The plane had begun its final approach to LAX, and the captain was announcing our arrival. But the silence in the first-class cabin was deafening. Even the flight attendants from other sections had gathered to witness this unprecedented confrontation. As we touched down and taxied to the gate, Jessica retreated to the galley area, clearly unable to face the passengers she would normally be thanking for flying with the airline. The other flight attendants were whispering among themselves, and I could see them casting shocked glances in my direction. The businessman next to me extended his hand. Agent Richardson, he said formally, thank you for your service to our country. And thank you for handling this situation with such dignity and grace. You were magnificent, said the elderly woman, tears in her own eyes. You stood up for all of us. As passengers began deplaning, many stopped to thank me, to apologize for what they had witnessed, or simply to shake my hand. A young black girl, maybe 16 years old, who had been traveling in a coach approached me with tears streaming down her face. I heard what happened up here, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for not letting her win. You made me feel proud of who I am." That comment hit me harder than all the discrimination I had endured. This young woman had witnessed someone who looked like her being mistreated, and then had seen that same person stand up with dignity and strength. Maybe she would remember this moment the next time someone tried to make her feel small or unwelcome. I made my way through the jet bridge and into the chaos of Los Angeles International Airport, my mind already shifting from the confrontation on the plane to the critical mission that lay ahead. As I walked through the terminal, I could see other passengers from my flight pointing me out to their companions, clearly still discussing what they had witnessed. At baggage claim, I was approached by Agent David Chin, my FBI liaison for the Los Angeles operation. He was a tall, serious man in his early 40s with the kind of intense focus that marked him as a veteran law enforcement officer. "Agent Richardson?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm David Chin, FBI Counterterrorism Division. Welcome to Los Angeles." "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Are we ready to begin operations immediately?" "Absolutely," he said, then paused and looked at me more carefully. "How was your flight?" I considered how to answer that question. I could tell him about the discrimination I had faced, about the flight attendant who had spent 5 hours trying to humiliate and harass me. But that would be a distraction from the mission, and American lives were potentially at stake. "Educational," I replied simply. Agent Chin gave me a curious look but didn't press for details. We collected my luggage and made our way to his vehicle, where he began briefing me on the latest intelligence developments. "The suspect cell has been meeting regularly at a warehouse in the port of Long Beach," he explained as we drove through LA traffic. "We believe they're planning to target shipping infrastructure, possibly using explosive devices to disrupt commercial traffic. Your cultural background and language skills should help us determine their exact plans and timeline." For the next 3 days, I threw myself into the mission with the intensity and focus that had made me successful throughout my career. Working undercover as a potential business partner, I infiltrated the terrorist cell and gained access to their planning documents. The operation required me to pose as a corrupt shipping company executive who could provide inside access to port facilities. It was dangerous work that required every skill I had developed over 8 years in the intelligence community. I had to earn the trust of people who had every reason to be suspicious of outsiders, while simultaneously gathering the evidence needed to prevent their attacks and bring them to justice. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day, when I was able to photograph detailed plans showing their intended targets and timeline. They were planning to detonate truck bombs at 3 separate locations during the following week's peak shipping period, which would have killed hundreds of dock workers and disrupted billions of dollars in international commerce. Working with Agent Chin and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, we coordinated simultaneous raids that resulted in the arrest of 7 suspects and the seizure of enough explosives to level several city blocks. The operation was a complete success. No shots were fired, no one was injured, and a catastrophic attack was prevented. As I prepared to return to Washington, D.C., I received several interesting pieces of correspondence that reminded me of the events aboard Flight 447. The first was an overnight letter from the airline's corporate headquarters. It was signed by the CEO himself and contained a formal apology for the treatment I had received, along with a voucher for free flights anywhere in their network. More importantly, it included confirmation that Jessica Reynolds had been suspended pending a full investigation and would be required to complete extensive diversity and sensitivity training before returning to duty. But what really caught my attention was the final paragraph of the letter. "We have reviewed video footage from the aircraft and interviewed multiple passengers who witnessed the incident. Your composure and professionalism in an extremely difficult situation reflect the highest standards of dignity and character. We are honored that someone of your caliber chose to fly with our airline, and we are committed to ensuring that such incidents never occur again." The second piece of correspondence was an email from the young woman who had approached me at the airport. Somehow, she had managed to find my contact information through social media and wanted to thank me again for what I had done. "Dear Agent Richardson," she wrote, "I can't stop thinking about what you did on that plane. You showed me that I don't have to accept being treated poorly just because of how I look. You showed me that I can stand up for myself with dignity and strength, even when people try to make me feel small. I'm a senior in high school now, and I've decided to apply to Georgetown University because that's where you went. I want to study international relations and maybe work for the government someday, just like you. Thank you for being an example of what's possible." Reading that email brought tears to my eyes. This young woman had witnessed discrimination and humiliation, but she had also seen strength, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. Maybe my confrontation with Jessica Reynolds had served a purpose beyond just defending my own dignity. The third surprise came a week later, when I received a call from the businessman who had been sitting next to me on the flight. He introduced himself as Marcus Thompson, the CEO of a major consulting firm in Los Angeles. "Agent Richardson," he said, "I've been thinking about what happened on that flight and I wanted you to know that it inspired me to take action in my own company. We've been reviewing our diversity and inclusion policies and frankly, we haven't been doing enough. I'd like to invite you to speak to our executive team about unconscious bias and the importance of creating inclusive environments." It seemed that the ripple effects of that 5-hour flight were continuing to spread, creating conversations and changes that might not have happened otherwise. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after returning to Washington, I was called into the office of CIA Director Sarah Morrison, no relation to the gate agent who had started my ordeal. "Agent Richardson," she said, gesturing for me to sit down, "I've been hearing interesting stories about your recent trip to Los Angeles." I felt a momentary panic, wondering if somehow my confrontation with the flight attendant had created problems for the agency. "Ma'am, I can explain." She held up her hand to stop me. "Agent Richardson, you handled an extremely difficult situation with exactly the kind of professionalism and dignity that represents the best of this organization. You completed a critical mission that saved American lives, and you did it while dealing with personal challenges that would have derailed many other operatives." She paused and looked at me directly. "I want you to know that your actions on that aircraft have been noticed at the highest levels of this government. The way you stood up for yourself while maintaining your cover and protecting your mission is exactly the kind of character we need in this organization." Then she smiled. "I'm promoting you to Senior Special Agent, effective immediately. And I'm assigning you to lead a new initiative focused on improving diversity and inclusion within the intelligence community. It's time we made sure that talented people like you never have to face the kind of treatment you experienced on that flight." As I sit here now, 6 months after that transformative flight from Washington to Los Angeles, I often think about the lessons learned from those 5 hours of harassment and humiliation. They looked at me and saw a threat. I showed them a protector. They saw someone who didn't belong. I revealed someone who had earned her place through service and sacrifice. They judged me by the color of my skin. I responded with the content of my character. Racism in America today rarely manifests as burning crosses or segregated water fountains. Instead, it shows up as a gate agent who needs to verify information she's already confirmed. It appears as a flight attendant who suddenly runs out of coffee just as she reaches your seat. It emerges in the assumption that you must be lost, confused, or in the wrong place simply because your skin color doesn't match someone's expectations. These microaggressions might seem minor to those who don't experience them, but they accumulate like drops of water that eventually carve canyons through stone. Each incident is a reminder that your presence is unwelcome, that you are being tolerated rather than respected, that you must constantly prove your worthiness to occupy spaces that others take for granted. But here's what I learned during my confrontation with Jessica Reynolds. Your dignity is not determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you respond to their treatment. You cannot control their prejudices, but you can control your reaction to those prejudices. I could have gotten angry. I could have yelled and made a scene. I could have allowed Jessica's ignorance to diminish my sense of self-worth or derail my mission. Instead, I chose to educate. I chose to stand up not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in a space they had every right to occupy. The fight against racism isn't won through grand gestures or historic legislation, though those things matter. It's won in moments like these when individuals choose to confront prejudice with dignity, when they refuse to accept being treated as less than human, when they stand up and declare, "I belong here too." Every interaction we have with people like Jessica Reynolds is an opportunity. We can choose to respond with anger and resentment, which only reinforces their negative stereotypes. Or we can choose to respond with strength and dignity, which forces them to confront their own biases and potentially opens their minds to new possibilities. I hope that Jessica Reynolds learned something from our encounter. I hope she thinks twice before making assumptions about passengers based on their appearance. I hope she realizes that the black woman in first class might be a doctor saving lives, a teacher shaping young minds, a lawyer fighting for justice, or yes, even a CIA agent protecting the country they both call home. But more than anything, I hope that the young woman who approached me at the airport remembers that she has every right to dream big dreams and fight for her place at every table where decisions are made. I hope she remembers that her worth is not determined by other people's prejudices, but by her own character, intelligence, and determination. Because that's how change happens in America. Not through sudden transformations or miraculous conversions, but through countless individual moments when people choose to be better than their worst impulses. It happens when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal or inevitable. It happens when we stand up with dignity and demand the respect we deserve as human beings. The terror cell I helped capture in Los Angeles was planning to attack the very infrastructure that keeps America functioning. They wanted to sow fear, division, and chaos in our society. But the real threats to American values often come from within, from people who claim to love this country while denying its promise of equality to their fellow citizens. Jessica Reynolds and Patricia Morrison may not have been plotting to blow up buildings, but they were attacking something just as fundamental: the idea that all Americans deserve to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race, religion, or background. Every time we allow discrimination to go unchallenged, we weaken the foundations of the society we claim to cherish. Every time we stand up against prejudice, we strengthen those foundations and move closer to the ideals that make America truly great. They tried to make me small. Instead, I showed them, and everyone watching, how to be bigger. I showed them that strength comes not from putting others down, but from lifting yourself and others up. I showed them that true patriotism means fighting for the rights and dignity of all Americans, not just the ones who look like you. That's a lesson worth learning no matter which country you're listening from. Because the struggle for dignity, respect, and equality is universal. It crosses borders and transcends cultures. It connects all of us who believe that every human being deserves to be judged by their character and their actions, not by the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. The next time you witness discrimination, remember Flight 447. Remember that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Remember that small acts of courage can create ripple effects that change lives and open minds. Remember that each of us has the power to make our society more just, more equal, and more worthy of the ideals we claim to share. And remember that sometimes, the person being discriminated against might be the very person working hardest to protect the freedoms and security that make such conversations possible in the first place. They judged me by my appearance. I showed them my service. They questioned my worth. I demonstrated my value. They tried to diminish my dignity. I responded by enlarging theirs. That's how we build a better America. One conversation, one confrontation, one act of courage at a time. This story serves as a reminder that racial discrimination persists in many forms throughout American society, often in everyday situations that might seem minor but collectively create hostile environments for people of color. It also demonstrates that responding to discrimination with dignity, strength, and education can create powerful moments of change and understanding. The goal is not to shame or blame, but to foster awareness, encourage empathy, and inspire all of us to examine our own biases while working to treat every person with the respect and dignity they deserve as fellow human beings.